Yeah. Well, I just wanted to talk, I guess, a little bit about not so much the different groups that call themselves Trotskyists. Again, there's a lot, but mainly on the specific method of Trotskyism, which, in my view, is the Marxist method. So I guess I wanted to kind of start out with where I originally came from as far as politically, because it really, I think, applies. I started out in a group called the Socialist Workers' Party, not the one in England, but the one here in the US, which originally was the one that Trotsky himself helped to build as the flagship Fourth International Party, led by like James Cannon and Farrell Dobbs, and a lot of people who were involved in some of the big, actually one of the main strike waves that began the CIO in the 30s, including the Toledo Auto Light strike, the Teamsters on the road strike. There's a lot of different, a whole bunch of strikes that they were involved in at the time. That was some of the genesis of the Socialist Workers' Party. So it's got a long Trotskyist tradition. So the thing about the SWP is that when I joined it, it had already fundamentally changed, I would say, in that about the time of the Sandinista Revolution in 1979, that party they decided that they were wrong, basically. The Trotskyist method was wrong, permanent revolution was wrong, the transitional method was wrong, and the only thing that they stuck with in the original Trotskyist ideas was the idea of the Revolutionary Party. So, basically, throughout my whole existence within the SWP, the idea of what I guess they came to as opposed to these basic ideas and methods was there's going to be a mass convergence of all these revolutionary forces. The FSLN had taken power in Nicaragua in 1979. The New Jewel movement in Grenada took power, led by Maurice Bishop. People probably don't know a lot about Grenada, but actually was right in the middle of a revolution in that really tiny country when the United States invaded it. It wasn't just shooting fish in a barrel. It was really actually a revolutionary movement that was going on. Also there was the movement that was growing with the FMLN in El Salvador, which seemed to follow something similar with the FSLN. The Cuban Communist Party seemed to be supporting these things, and it seemed all these things seemed to maybe point to the idea that perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps the permanent revolution is wrong. Perhaps there is a two-stage theory. Perhaps there is some kind of middle stage of democracy, the democratic revolution, that will unfold. And as it unfolds, perhaps like socialists will get some time later on to have a socialist revolution. So a lot of different things kind of came out of this idea, which was, first off, kind of an uncritical support of these movements. So where you have the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, that initially there was a huge push for socialism. Gradually that died down and it became more and more watered down by well, we need to have a democratic government. We need to have the radicalism initially kind of died down. There were some issues with indigenous people in Nicaragua that were maybe some misunderstandings between them and the government that ended up leading to like a massacre. But basically all these different governments throughout the world became the FSLN, the ANC in South Africa, the Cuban Communist Party, the IRA in Ireland, the ETA in Spain, or more precisely their political arms like Sinn Féin, or I think the ETA is I can't remember the political arm of ETA, but at any rate, basically the whole thing became essentially we're going to support these groups and these governments uncritically, right? So a lot of times, like I read the theoretical understanding that the leaders of the group had, his name is Jack Barnes, which came out in a book called The New International. There's like 13 or 14 volumes out now. But basically, based on these things, I expected a lot different turnout, I think, than what actually ended up happening with these particular movements. The FSLN at the time had, oh, I guess I kind of already went over the FSLN, but I guess maybe we'll go over the ANC. The ANC, initially, maybe people who are a little bit, were around during the time, I don't want to say a little bit older, but I guess you were a little bit older, remember, like there was this big, revolutionary movement going on in South Africa. People around the world were supporting this, end apartheid campaign. There's Nelson Mandela was in prison for 30 years, and he became, a cause célèbre. And it just seemed, when they had the elections, it was just like this euphoria. But anyway, it kind of makes sense. Like I can see back at the time, like all these different movements. You can see maybe a convergence happening between all these different disparate movements, and maybe saying, well, maybe we were wrong, because nothing seemed to be going out, nothing seemed to be panning out for the Trotskyists, So I want to talk about some of the outcomes of all these different movements, how they play to shape or help me shape my understanding of revolution and socialism, and why I call myself, a Trotskyist, and why I feel like that means Marxist, basically how it came to that conclusion. I did want to talk about primarily three main things within the method of Trotskyism that kind of differentiates it, I think, from other strands that might call themselves Marxist or that are pro-revolution, even if they don't call themselves Marxist, which is the three main things I would say are the transitional method, permanent revolution, and the role of the Revolutionary Party. Now, with the permanent revolution, I guess I'll start with that. Permanent revolution, the fundamental idea behind permanent revolution, maybe it's been misunderstood. I think it's been overblown, maybe exaggerated. But the whole point of the permanent revolution is not that revolution has to begin in a billion different countries all at the same time, for example. I don't know if that's a strongman argument. I don't know if anyone thinks that. But that is one thing I've heard people say about it. It's also not that there's no democratic revolution at all. The permanent revolution basically says that the democratic revolution cannot, in this stage in history, be led by the capitalist class. It can't. The capitalist class will not lead it, and in fact, because of all the strands they have to capital, and all the strands capital has with imperialism, in the end they'll be more afraid of the revolution than they will of their imperialist overlords, right? So ultimately, the task of the democratic revolution falls to the working class, and as such, there's no defining difference in stage. There might be different stages of the revolution ultimately, but in the end, they're ultimately connected. They're utterly connected. The democratic revolution, and this is all based on Trotsky's participation and understanding of the 1905 revolution, where there was different capitalist government, or excuse me, within 1905 and in 1917, where there was a lot of support for the idea of maybe a mechanical understanding of Marx and Marxism, which stated that the capitalist revolution had happened first, and then later on the socialist one could happen. When in reality, in the 1905 revolution and the 1917 revolutions, workers took the main stage, and ultimately, because the democratic revolution couldn't, which is in the end was things like land to the peasants, reforming the government, having a democratic constituent assembly, things like this. They couldn't be achieved even under the whatever the capitalists or even the radical middle class wanted to achieve in Russia. So this is the basis of his understanding of it. Was the 1905 revolution, which he expanded on into 1917. Like I said, my own personal experience led me to believe that groups like, for example, the ANC, which I was told were leading the democratic revolution, at a certain point, that would turn into the socialists, Looking back on what's happened with and not just the ANC, but groups like the IRA, which I feel are, very specifically nationalist, although there is definitely like an element of maybe like pro-socialism within them, that what ended up happening with all these different groups, the Good Friday Agreement ended up being, in my view, a huge disaster. It really ended up just making a little Irish capitalist government. Exactly what James Connolly said would happen if that ever happened. If there was ever I guess a shamrock raised over the Irish Parliament, what would end up happening? It would turn into an oppressive capitalist government tied to imperialism. It's precisely, in my view, what happened. I was very shocked and appalled at what Sinn Féin did there. Same with the ANC. I was completely shocked by Nelson Mandela. Like at first I was like, wow, it's amazing we have the beginnings of a democratic revolution. The reality is they sold out to neoliberalism almost immediately. And I don't mean they waited for Thabo Mbeki, the successor to Nelson Mandela. They literally did it, under Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela himself led the neoliberal charge in South Africa.